Pope Francis has brought forth a central theme of encounter. But to understand this theme, we must first learn what encounter means. The formal definition in the dictionary is to come upon or meet with, especially unexpectedly. However, Pope Francis sees it as much more. As in his first language, Spanish, the word encounter has a much different meaning, which is why he sees encounter as more than just a single interaction, but instead a dynamic back and forth between two parties. It is not necessarily just between two humans, but instead this encounter may be between yourself and God. Pope Francis reminds us that the gospel tells us constantly to run the risk of face-to-face encounters with others, with their physical presence which challenges us, with their pain and their pleas, with their joy which infects us in our close and continuous interactions. Encounter is much more than just a single moment. Instead, it is the way in which we are to think of our relationships with one another, especially towards the poor and marginalized. But why does Pope Francis think a culture of encounter is so important? By building a culture of encounter, we can pull those who are excluded from the margin and invite them to participate in society. Through meaningful encounters, where we not only help people, but also work to understand them, we can begin to build a future where everyone is included. This is so important because we need each other. As much as we'd like to think that we can do it all on our own, it is human nature to be social and to be dependent on one another. In his TED Talk, Pope Francis says, "Quite a few years of life have strengthened my conviction that each and everyone's existence is deeply tied to that of others. Life is not time merely passing by. Life is about interactions. It is these interactions with others that give life meaning. A frequently used expression is that money cannot buy happiness. This is because the things in life that give us true happiness also cannot be bought. The love that comes from encounters with others is what we truly seek. However, today's culture is becoming increasingly caught up in consumerism. We often place more value on objects than the lives of our brothers and sisters in need." Pope Francis titled the TED Talk he gave, "The Only Future Worth Building Includes Everyone. A good measure of society is how the least among us are managing." By excluding those who need us most, are we really making progress? Pope Francis states in Joy of the Gospel that each individual Christian and every community is called to be an instrument of God for the liberation and promotion of the poor and for enabling them to be fully a part of society. Only by giving everybody the chance to participate in society to their fullest of their God-given potential can we truly begin to move forward. Pope Francis calls us to end exclusion and bring about a future of inclusion through encounter. He states that we must work to eliminate the structural causes of poverty and to promote the integral development of the poor, as well as small daily acts of solidarity in meeting the real needs which we encounter. By living a life full of encounters, we can not only become more fulfilled ourselves, but also help those on the margin rejoin the society. Even the name Francis is a symbol of encounter, as Pope Francis chose the name after St. Francis of Assisi. Being a Jesuit, many people believed Pope Francis would have chosen his name after St. Francis Xavier, but this is not the case. So what is the significance of St. Francis of Assisi, and how is this saint tied to encounter? During the medieval times, St. Francis humbly denied his father's inheritance, embraced a life of poverty, and sought out those in the margins, especially the lepers. At the time, lepers were poorly treated by society, as they were feared and exiled despite their suffering. You can imagine just how countercultural it would have been for St. Francis to go and engage the lepers, which shocked everyone during his time. As encounter requires of us, St. Francis broke free of accepting everything in life as the norm, acknowledged that there was a problem with how society was treating people, and encountered those living at the margins in order to fix it. St. Francis learned from his experiences at the margin and worked to make a change in his community. By choosing this name, Pope Francis is showing all of us that a revolution is at hand. It is not enough to just go along with the status quo. We must work diligently to have encounters and love those who may have been forgotten. Pope Francis calls us to build generous solidarity through a culture of encounter. It calls for an evangelized popular culture containing values of faith and solidarity, capable of encouraging the development of a more just and believing society, and possesses a particular wisdom which ought to be gratefully acknowledged. As we encounter the world around us through pilgrimages and spreading the word of God, we find truth and love in one another, coming together in a spontaneous reaction by those who recognize that the social function of property and the universal destination of goods are realities which come before private property. In order to pull forgotten peoples from the margin, we must first realize that their life is more important than our wealth. Victor Hugo once said that you can give without loving, but you can never love without giving. If we want to truly have loving encounters, we must be prepared to give of ourselves. In this way, a culture of encounter builds habits of solidarity as we meet real needs which we encounter. Pope Francis uses a culture of encounter to urge us to grow in solidarity, which would allow peoples to become artisans of their own destinies, since every person is called to self-fulfillment. Solidarity, in its deepest and most challenging sense, thus becomes a way of making history in a life setting where conflicts, tensions, and oppositions can achieve a diversified and life-giving unity. In this sense, the solidarity built through a culture of encounter calls for profound social humility. Pope Francis serves as an example of how a life of encounter should look. If we all follow his example of encounter, we will all help to make the world a more tender and loving place.